Hook intro. Imagine stepping into a world without airplanes, where crossing the ocean took weeks instead of hours, and where the rattle of horse-drawn carriages or the hiss of steam engines echoed across cobbled streets. The Victorian era wasn't just about stiff collars and grand manners. It was also about adventure, discomfort, strange customs, and endless waiting. Tonight, let's wander back to the 19th century and uncover what Victorian travel was really like. A slow, fascinating, and often exhausting journey that might just help you drift peacefully to sleep. Before the arrival of the shrieking steam engine or the great ocean liner, the world moved at the pace of horses, sails, and human footsteps. To us, who live in an age of high-speed trains and airplanes that glide across continents in a matter of hours, it is almost impossible to imagine the slower, heavier rhythm of Victorian life. Yet, in order to truly understand what travel meant to the Victorians, we must step back into the early 19th century, into a world where movement itself was a challenge, and where every journey was an adventure, though not always a pleasant one. Imagine a young gentleman in 1830 preparing to leave his quiet country home for London. The capital city lay only 100 miles away, but in those days 100 miles was a journey of nearly 2 days. He would rise before dawn, pull on his stiff collar and heavy coat, and stand in the frosty air waiting for the mail coach to arrive. The coach, drawn by 4 powerful horses, would already be half filled with other passengers, ladies wrapped in shawls, merchants clutching their ledgers, perhaps even a soldier on leave. Inside the wooden carriage, the seats were narrow, the air close and musty. And so began the long, rattling ride along muddy roads, wheels bouncing over stones, every mile a slow negotiation between horse, weather, and road. For the Victorians, the very idea of travel was something extraordinary. Today we step into cars, trains, or airplanes without much thought. But to them, setting out meant leaving behind comfort, predictability, and safety. It meant preparing for dust, mud, delays, and dangers both real and imagined. Travel was not a daily habit, but a serious undertaking. For the rural poor, it was often rare. Some lived their whole lives without ever journeying beyond the nearest village. For the wealthy, it was a statement of status, a chance to prove one's refinement, and a way to see and be seen in society. Before the great railway boom of the 1840s, roads across Britain were rough and uneven. Although turnpike trusts had begun to improve them, many routes remained deeply rutted by wheels and churned by rain into sticky, clinging mud. A trip in winter could be a test of endurance. Cold winds whistled through carriage cracks, sleet blurred the windows, and cloaks or blankets offered little comfort. Summer, too, carried its discomforts, with clouds of dust coating passengers, horses, and luggage alike. For many, the journey was an exhausting trial before the true business or pleasure of travel even began, and yet there was a kind of romance to this slower pace. To travel was to step into uncertainty, to surrender to the road. One never quite knew when one would arrive, what sights might appear along the way. The hedgerows, the taverns, the toll gates, the blacksmith hammering away at a village forge, these small details stitched themselves into the memory of travellers. Zoes. Diaries of the time are filled with such observations, tiny sketches of rural life seen from the jolting window of a coach. But let us imagine further back, into the early Victorian years, when even the idea of a holiday travel was still forming. Tourism, as we know it, did not truly exist. Journeys were made for duty, for business, for education, for family obligations, or for health. Wealthy invalids were sent to seaside towns such as Brighton or Bath in search of salt air or mineral waters believed to restore vigour. Scholars travelled to great libraries, politicians travelled to the House of Commons, merchants travelled to ports and markets. Rarely did one set out merely for the pleasure of the road. The cost of travel was another barrier. A long coach ride to London could be as expensive as a week's wages for a working man. For the middle classes, careful saving was required to afford tickets, food, and lodging. For the very poor, walking remained the only option, feet blistered and weary on the long stretches of road. Pedestrian travel might sound quaint, but in truth it was grueling. Records tell of men and women trudging for days to seek work, carrying their belongings in bundles, sleeping by hedges when inns were too costly. Ships, too, carried travellers across rivers and seas, but here again the pace was slow. Before the widespread use of steam power, sailing vessels were at the mercy of wind and tide. A trip across the English Channel might take only a few hours in good weather, but in bad it could stretch into days, the passengers trapped in cramped cabins, sick from the pitching of the ship. Letters from the period describe seasickness as an almost universal affliction, endured with grim patience. Those who could afford it hired private cabins. Others squeezed together in shared spaces, trying to find rest on hard bunks. Thus, the world before easy travel was a world of patience, discomfort, and uncertainty. Journeys were not taken lightly, and each one held within it a sense of adventure simply because it was not easy. To set out was to test one's endurance, to leave behind the known, and to step into a moving world where time stretched and slowed. It is perhaps this slowness that we, in our hurried age, have forgotten. A Victorian journey forced travellers to look closely at the small details of life. The landscape changing mile by mile, the steady rhythm of hooves, the creak of leather harnesses, the smell of hay at roadside stables. Each sound and scent marked the passage of time, reminding them that distance was something earned, not taken for granted. And so, before we rush ahead to the thrilling days of steam locomotives and iron tracks, we pause here in this older world where travel was a trial, a test, and sometimes a joy. It is in this slower, harder rhythm of movement that we find the true beginning of Victorian travel, a world where the road was both a barrier and an invitation. The world of the early 19th century moved with a heavy, deliberate rhythm, a rhythm we can barely imagine today. To us, journeys are measured in hours and minutes, compressed by the speed of cars, trains and airplanes. But for the Victorians, distance was not merely a matter of numbers. It was a trial of endurance, patience, and persistence. To travel meant to surrender to uncertainty, to leave behind the safety of hearth and home, and to step into a world where every mile was earned with aching muscles, rattling wheels, and restless nights. Imagine for a moment a gentleman standing outside his country home in the year 1830. The first light of dawn is breaking, a thin mist clings to the hedges, and the only sound is the distant clatter of hooves. He waits for the mail coach, the pride of the road, which will take him to London. The city lies a mere 100 miles away, yet this journey will consume nearly 2 days of his life. The coach arrives at last, drawn by 4 sweating horses, their sides heaving, their harnesses glistening with dew. Inside, the wooden carriage is already crowded. A lady pulls her shawl tighter around her shoulders, a merchant balances his ledger on his knees, and the smell of damp wool and leather fills the confined space. The gentleman climbs aboard, settles uneasily into a narrow seat, and with a jolt the coach lurches forward. The road ahead is long and uncertain. Rain has turned the surface into mud. The wheels sink and drag, splattering the sides of the carriage. Every rut and stone is felt in the bones of the passengers, who sway and bump against one another with each jarring motion. In winter, icy winds whistle through cracks in the coach, numbing fingers and toes despite thick cloaks and gloves. In summer, clouds of dust swirl, coating hair, clothes, and luggage alike. Conversation falters as the hours stretch, and the journey becomes a test of patience more than an occasion of excitement. And yet, there was something strangely romantic about such travel. Diaries and letters from the time reveal how travellers noticed every detail along the road, the hedgerows blooming with hawthorn, the blacksmith's forge glowing in a village they passed at dusk, the call of birds across misty fields. For those unused to leaving home, these small impressions were etched deeply into memory. Even a trip of 50 miles became a story to be told, a chain of sights and sensations strung together by the steady rhythm of wheels and hooves. Travel was, above all, expensive. For the wealthy, a coach ticket was manageable, but for the working man, the price of a long journey might equal an entire week's wages. Many could not dream of affording such comfort. Instead, they walked. One can picture a poor labourer trudging along the road, his belongings tied in a bundle, his shoes worn to thin leather, pausing to rest on a milestone or to beg a crust of bread at a farmhouse door. He would sleep under hedges or in barns if no cheap inn could be found, waking stiff and hungry to walk again at dawn. Journeys of this kind were gruelling, but they were also common, for the Victorian world was full of men and women moving in search of work, family, or opportunity. Sea travel too was slow and uncertain. Before the arrival of steamships, sailing vessels depended entirely on wind and tide. A simple crossing of the English Channel, which today takes a little more than an hour, might stretch into 2 days if the weather turned foul. Passengers huddled in cramped cabins, groaning with seasickness as the ship pitched and rolled. Private cabins were a luxury reserved for the rich, while the rest shared crowded bunks, the air thick with damp and the smell of salt. Yet, despite the misery, these voyages carried with them a sense of mystery. The sight of the horizon stretching endlessly before them, the creak of ropes and the snap of sails, the sudden cry of a gull circling above, these moments stirred both fear and awe in travellers unused to the vastness of the sea. For those who did not travel at all, which was the case for many rural Victorians, journeys remained something exotic, almost fantastical. There are records of men and women who lived their entire lives within a radius of 20 miles, who knew every path and hedge of their village but never saw a city, never heard the roar of the sea, never walked beneath the spires of a great cathedral. Travel was, for them, something heard about in stories, something that belonged to merchants, gentry, or adventurous sons who had gone away and returned with tales of distant lands. Those who could travel often did so out of necessity rather than leisure. Tourism, as we think of it today, was still in its infancy. Journeys were made for business, for education, for family visits, or for health. Seaside towns such as Brighton and Bath became popular, not because people sought relaxation, but because doctors prescribed sea air or mineral waters for ailments of the lungs, stomach, or nerves. Carriages of invalids lined the promenades, wrapped in blankets, breathing the briny breeze in hopes of recovery. Students made long treks to universities, merchants hauled goods to ports, and politicians travelled to the Houses of Parliament. Pleasure travel was rare, and when it did happen, it was usually the privilege of the very rich, who might tour the continent to polish their manners and broaden their education. The slowness of travel also shaped the way people thought about time. Letters took days, sometimes weeks, to arrive. A message sent from one city might not reach its destination until the sender had already moved on. There was no instant communication to coordinate meetings or reassure anxious families. The traveller was, in many ways, cut off, living in a liminal space between departure and arrival. Each day on the road was its own small world, self-contained, with its own discomforts and discoveries. Danger was a constant companion too. Coaches could overturn on rough roads, horses might bolt, bridges collapse, or storms break without warning. Bandits were a fading but still remembered threat, particularly on lonely rural roads. Illness was another hazard. Exposure to cold, damp, or exhaustion could lay a traveller low far from home and familiar care. To travel was to accept these risks as part of the price. Every departure was tinged with uncertainty, every arrival greeted with relief. And yet, for all its trials, Victorian travel had its charms. The very difficulty of the road made the destinations sweeter. To arrive at last in London, after 2 days of jolting in mud, was to feel a surge of triumph. For triumph. The city, with its smoke, its noise, its endless streets, seemed to burst into life before the weary traveller's eyes. The same was true of smaller destinations. To reach a cousin's farmhouse, to see the sea for the first time, to stand before a cathedral whose spire had been only a rumour until that moment. These experiences carried a weight, a depth, because they were not easily won. Looking back, we might envy this slower world where journeys unfolded gradually and each stage was savoured or endured in turn. The Victorian traveller had no choice but to observe, to listen, to notice. The sound of hooves, the creak of harness leather, the jingle of harness bells, the smell of hay at a roadside inn, all became part of the fabric of travel. In the endless hours between departure and arrival, the mind wandered, the imagination stirred, and the journey itself became as memorable as the destination. This then was the world before easy travel, a world of mud and dust, of creaking coaches and rolling ships, of patience stretched and comfort scarce. It was a world where distance mattered, where every mile cost time, money, and effort. And yet, it was also a world where travel meant something profound, where the act of moving from one place to another carried with it a weight, an importance that we who fly over continents in hours may never truly understand. The story of Victorian travel cannot be told without pausing to imagine the rattle and sway of a carriage on a long, uneven road. For most travellers in the first half of the 19th century, this was the ordinary experience of movement. The railway had not yet stretched its iron fingers across the countryside, or if it had, it was still limited to certain routes. For countless men, women and children, the coach remained the only way to cover long distances. and the coach was as far from comfort as one can imagine. Picture a tall, lumbering vehicle of wood and iron, its body painted in dark colours, its wheels tall and narrow. 4, sometimes 6 horses strained in front, tossing their heads against leather bridles, their breath steaming in the morning chill. Inside the coach, passengers were squeezed shoulder to shoulder, knees pressed close, with hardly room to shift position. Luggage was strapped to the roof, rattling precariously with every bump. Those who could not afford a seat inside clung to the outside, exposed to wind, rain and dust, gripping whatever handhold they could find. The journey began with high spirits, perhaps even laughter, as travellers exchanged greetings and settled themselves. But as the hours passed, the cheer gave way to silence. The constant jolt of wheels striking ruts jarred every bone. Dust rose in choking clouds during summer and mud splashed high in winter, coating clothes and faces alike. When the road climbed into hills, the pace slowed to a crawl, horses straining, harnesses creaking, coachmen urging with crack of whip and shout of command. On descents, the coach swayed dangerously, brakes groaning, passengers clutching straps or one another in fear of overturning. Inns dotted the main roads, offering places for coaches to change horses and for travellers to take a hurried meal. The arrival of a coach was a lively moment, dogs barking, ostlers rushing to unhitch tired animals, stable boys leading fresh teams into position. Passengers stretched stiff legs, stamped mud from boots, and hurried inside for ale, bread and meat before the horn sounded again and the coach rolled onward. But meals were often hurried and unsatisfying, eaten in dim, smoky rooms with strangers. Many a traveller climbed back aboard still hungry, bracing themselves for more hours of discomfort. The roads themselves varied wildly. Some turnpikes were kept in fair repair, gravel packed down by endless traffic, but others were little more than tracks, rutted, flooded, or strewn with stones. A sudden rainstorm could turn a journey into misery, mud sucking at wheels until the coach slowed to a crawl. More than once, passengers were forced to climb down and walk, their boots sinking ankle-deep as they trudged beside the struggling horses. In winter, snow drifted across the road, obscuring the path and leaving the coachman to guess his way by hedge and tree. Accidents were common. Wheels snapped, axles broke or horses stumbled. To ride in a coach was to accept the risk of delay, injury or worse. Yet for all its hardships, there was something unforgettable about coach travel. The rhythm of hooves striking the road, the smell of leather and horse sweat, the crack of the driver's whip, and the steady clatter of iron-rimmed wheels created a music all their own. Travellers spoke of the long hours as both exhausting and strangely hypnotic. There was time, endless time, to gaze out at the countryside sliding past. Fields dotted with sheep, cottages with smoke curling from chimneys, the occasional church spire piercing the horizon. The slow passage of landscape imprinted itself upon the mind, and even in discomfort there was a sense of moving through a living picture. For the poor, of course, the coach was often out of reach. They walked the same roads that carriages rattled along, trudging mile after mile with weary feet. Dust rose around them in summer, and in winter the mud clung to their skirts and boots until every step was a labour. At night they slept in hedgerows or barns, too poor to afford the fee of an inn. And yet they walked, because to move was sometimes the only chance at survival, the only hope of work in another town, or of reaching family who might help. These travellers knew the roads more intimately than any coachman. Every milestone, every stream, every village was marked in memory by blisters and hunger. But even for those within the coaches, wealth brought only limited relief. A gentleman might afford to hire a private carriage, a lighter vehicle with his own horses, giving him freedom to travel in relative quiet. But private carriages too rattled and swayed, wheels jolting against the same ruts, bodies tossed from side to side with each rough patch. Cushions helped, but not much, and the pace was little better. The best horses could only maintain a certain speed before tiring, and frequent stops were required to rest, water, and feed them. No matter the class of traveller, all were bound by the limits of the road and the stamina of animals. The dust, especially, was a constant enemy. In summer, when days were dry and the sun baked the earth, the wheels and hooves raised choking clouds that clung to clothing, hair and skin. Passengers arrived at their destinations streaked in grey, coughing and wiping grit from their eyes. Letters from the time complain of hair turned stiff with dust, of handkerchiefs blackened after wiping a face, of the taste of dirt in every mouthful of food. And still the road went on. Night travel was even more perilous. Lanterns lit the way, their dim glow casting long shadows across hedges and trees. The road seemed alive with darkness, every sound amplified, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen animals, the creak of the coach itself. Passengers dozed uneasily, heads bumping against one another, waking with each lurch and jolt. For some, the darkness heightened fears of robbery. Though highwaymen were becoming rarer by the Victorian era, the memory of their attacks lingered, and stories of travellers stripped of money and jewels circulated widely. And yet, for all the hardship, there was pride in endurance. To survive a long journey by carriage was an accomplishment, a story to be retold. The discomfort became part of the memory, woven into the tale of reaching a destination. Travellers who arrived weary, stiff and dust covered also arrived triumphant. They had conquered the road, endured its endless ruts and jolts, and emerged at last in a new place, ready to face whatever awaited them. This was the essence of travel before railways reshaped the world. Long hours of rattle and sway, dust in the throat, mud on the boots, and the steady beat of hooves carrying one forward. It was a journey that demanded patience and strength, a journey that left its mark on body and spirit alike. And though we might shudder at the thought of enduring such discomfort today, the Victorians accepted it as the natural rhythm of life, for the road was their only highway to the wider world. The quiet rhythm of hooves and the weary sway of carriages began to fade in the early decades of the 19th century, replaced by something louder, faster, and altogether stranger. At first, people did not know what to make of it. They heard a distant rumble, felt the trembling of the earth, and then saw, with startled eyes, a plume of smoke and a shining machine thundering down a line of iron rails. To many Victorians, the railway was not simply a new way of travelling. It was a force that changed the very meaning of distance, time, and life itself. Imagine the astonishment of a farmer watching from his field as the first locomotives tore past. Horses reared and bolted, cows scattered, and villagers gathered at fences to see the iron monster rush by. The engine hissed and clanked, wheels hammering against metal tracks, sparks flying into the air. The smell of coal smoke drifted across the countryside, settling in hair and clothes, and the sound carried for miles. A steady, rhythmic pounding unlike anything that had come before. Some swore the sight was unnatural, almost demonic, a challenge to the natural order of things. Others stood in awe, convinced that this machine represented the future. For travellers, the change was immediate and profound. A journey that once took 2 days by coach could now be completed in just a few hours. The cramped, dusty carriage, swaying and bumping along muddy roads, was replaced by the straight, steady glide of a railway compartment. The speed was dizzying. Early passengers described the sensation as both thrilling and terrifying, as the countryside blurred past faster than the human eye was accustomed to seeing. Some clutched the edges of their seats, certain that the unnatural pace would crush their bodies or unhinge their minds. Doctors even warned that travelling so quickly could damage the brain or harm the heart. Yet people kept climbing aboard, drawn by the irresistible promise of arriving sooner, cheaper, and with far less discomfort. Railway stations themselves became marvels of the age. Where once there had been only small inns or coaching yards, now great structures of glass and iron rose against the sky. Inside, crowds gathered, tickets clutched in hand, the air thick with smoke, chatter, and the hiss of engines at rest. The platforms were alive with motion, porters hauling luggage, guards blowing whistles, families embracing or waving farewell. To step into a station was to step into a new world of energy and possibility, where departure and arrival followed a timetable as precise as clockwork. Inside the trains, passengers experienced a strange mixture of comfort and unease. The compartments were narrow, with benches lining either side, but they offered protection from weather and more space than a coach. The poor could buy cheaper tickets for open carriages, exposed to wind and smoke, while the wealthy travelled in more luxurious cars with padded seats and even private compartments. Windows framed the rushing countryside, fields and villages flickering by too quickly to study in detail. The steady rhythm of the wheels against the rails created a sound that lulled some into uneasy sleep, while others sat wide-eyed, unable to believe how swiftly they were moving. Not everyone welcomed this new speed. Farmers complained that the noise frightened livestock. Poets lamented that the beauty of the countryside was spoiled by smoke and iron. Some argued that people were not meant to travel so fast, that nature itself would rebel against such intrusion. But the trains kept running, more tracks were laid, and soon it was possible to cross England, Scotland, or Wales in a fraction of the time once required. Businessmen embraced the railway, for it allowed them to travel to markets and cities with new efficiency. Families embraced it, for it allowed visits that once seemed impossible. Even the working classes, though often relegated to the cheapest and most uncomfortable carriages, found that they could reach places once beyond their reach. There was also a new sense of rhythm in daily life. The railway demanded punctuality. Coaches might be delayed by weather, horses, or chance, but trains moved according to the clock. To miss a train was to miss one's chance entirely, and so watches were checked, timetables studied, and the very concept of time grew stricter, sharper. Villages set their clocks by the railway, synchronizing life itself to the iron rails that cut across the land. For the first time in history, time became standardized, unified by the timetable of trains. Of course, the early days were not without discomforts. The smoke from burning coal drifted into carriages, leaving eyes watering and lungs irritated. Sparks sometimes flew through open windows, burning holes in clothing. The noise was loud and constant, and the sudden lurches of starting and stopping unsettled stomachs unused to such motion. Accidents, too, were a grim reality. Trains that left the rails, collisions at crossings, boilers that burst, these tragedies struck terror into the hearts of many, reminding them that this powerful new invention was still dangerous. And yet, despite the risks, the crowds continued to grow, filling trains to overflowing. It is difficult for us, who can cross entire continents in mere hours, to imagine the wonder Victorians felt at their first railway journeys. For them, the world seemed to shrink. Distant cities became neighbours, seaside towns became accessible for day trips, and entire regions that once seemed remote were suddenly within reach. The Iron Road did not just carry passengers, it carried ideas, fashions, newspapers and goods, spreading culture and commerce at a speed never known before. Even those who distrusted the railway could not deny its power. Villages that once lay quiet found themselves transformed into bustling stops along the line. Inns that had depended on coach traffic fell into decline, while new hotels rose near stations to welcome a different kind of traveller. Entire landscapes changed, as bridges spanned valleys and tunnels pierced through hills, bending nature to the will of the machine. The age of the horse was not gone overnight, but it was no longer supreme. The iron horse had arrived, and with it, the world of travel would never be the same again. For the Victorian sleeper, lying in bed after a day's journey, the sound of the railway lingered in memory. The hiss of steam, the shriek of a whistle, the pounding rhythm of wheels on iron, all of it repeated itself in dreams, a new music for a new age. And though many complained of smoke, noise and speed, there was no denying that the railway had captured the imagination of an entire generation. It was a machine that promised freedom, and once tasted, that freedom could not be forgotten. The railway had shrunk the land, but the sea remained vast and untamed. To leave the shores of Britain in the 19th century was to step into a world of rolling waves, shifting winds, and the uncertain power of steam. Long before airplanes and cruise liners, the Victorian traveller climbed aboard steamships, great, smoking vessels that promised to carry them across the oceans faster than sails alone could manage. Yet for all their promise, these ships carried with them discomforts and dangers enough to fill any diary. Picture the scene at a busy port. The air is thick with the mingled smells of salt water, coal smoke, and tar. Gulls wheel overhead, their cries sharp against the clatter of ropes and chains. Porters shout as they haul heavy trunks up gangplanks, families cluster together in nervous anticipation, and uniformed officers pace the deck, barking orders to sailors who scurry to and fro. Somewhere in the distance, the great boilers of the ship hiss and throb, preparing to unleash their power. For the traveller standing on the dock, hat in hand and ticket folded neatly in a pocket, this is a moment of excitement tinged with fear. Ahead lies the unknown sea, a place both romantic and terrifying. Once aboard, the traveller is shown to his cabin. If he is wealthy, it may be a small private room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a tiny porthole through which he can glimpse the restless water. If he is of modest means, the space may be shared with others, narrow bunks stacked close together, the air already close and stuffy before the ship has even left the harbour. For the poor, in steerage conditions are worse still. Long rows of hammocks or wooden berths crammed into the lowest decks, where light is scarce and the smell of damp sweat and engine smoke fills the lungs. Whatever the class, the passenger knows that this cabin, whether comfortable or cramped, will be his world for days or even weeks. The moment of departure is unforgettable. A whistle shrieks, ropes are cast off, and the ship begins to move. Families wave handkerchiefs from the dock, voices raised in last farewells that are quickly lost to the growing distance. The engines throb louder, smoke billows from tall funnels, and the ship eases out into the open water. The city recedes, then the shoreline itself grows faint, and at last there is nothing but the horizon and the steady roll of the sea. For the traveller, a strange mixture of emotions rises, the thrill of adventure, the ache of leaving home, and the nervous anticipation of the journey ahead. But the sea, unlike the railway, does not run to a timetable. It has moods of its own, and it makes those moods known swiftly. On a calm day, the ship glides across glassy waters, the wake trailing behind like a white ribbon. Passengers stroll the decks, women shading their faces with parasols, men smoking cigars, children chasing one another under the watchful eyes of governesses. Meals are served in long saloons, where polished brass lamps swing gently with the motion of the ship. Conversation drifts lazily, letters are written, diaries begun. There is even music sometimes as a piano is coaxed into song despite the gentle sway beneath it. Then comes the storm. The sky darkens, wind rises, and waves begin to lift and toss the ship as though it were a toy. Passengers who had felt quite at ease a day before now grow pale and silent, clutching at railings or retreating to their cabins. The rolling of the vessel becomes violent, dishes slide from tables, lamps sway dangerously, and the creak of wood and iron fills every corridor. Seasickness spreads quickly, leaving cabins filled with groans and misery. For many, it is their first true taste of the sea, and it is not a welcome one. Diaries of the time are filled with weary lines about days spent unable to rise from bed, every motion of the waves turning the stomach anew. The crew, hardened by countless voyages, move about their duties with grim determination. Sailors haul ropes, stoke the fires, and secure loose cargo as water crashes over the decks. The captain stands firm on the bridge, coat whipped by wind, eyes fixed on the shifting horizon. To the passengers, it seems impossible that such violence can be endured, but slowly, eventually, the storm passes, the sky clears, the sea calms, and the world returns to a kind of uneasy peace. Even in calmer weather, the sea crossing was far from luxurious by modern standards. The air inside cabins grew foul quickly, especially in steerage where ventilation was poor and the press of bodies unrelenting. Fresh water was rationed, food often plain and repetitive, salted meat, ship's biscuits, tea, and occasionally soup or potatoes. For those unused to such fare, the monotony was wearisome, and many dreamed of fresh fruit or a proper meal ashore. Cleanliness was a constant struggle, with limited facilities for washing and shared privies that left much to be desired. Rats were not uncommon, scuttling in the shadows, and the constant vibration of engines made restful sleep difficult. Yet there was wonder too. Passengers described evenings spent on deck, watching the sun sink into the sea in a blaze of gold and crimson. At night, the stars stretched across the heavens, brighter and more numerous than ever seen on land. The ship's wake glowed with phosphorescence, tiny sparks of light stirred by the churning water, giving the impression that the vessel sailed through a sea of stars both above and below. Dolphins sometimes leapt alongside, their sleek bodies catching the moonlight, and on rare occasions whales were glimpsed, their massive forms breaking the surface before sinking silently once more. For those bound for distant lands, India, Australia, America, the voyage became a kind of suspended time, a world between worlds, days blended into one another, marked only by meals, the ringing of the ship's bell, and the gradual change of climate. In colder latitudes, passengers wrapped themselves in cloaks and scarves, while closer to the equator they sought shade beneath awnings, fanning themselves against the heavy heat. Friendships formed in these long days, as strangers thrown together found common comfort in conversation, shared games of cards, or quiet readings of books. Romances too sometimes blossomed, the isolation of the ship creating an intensity that would have been unlikely on land. But always there was the sense of risk. Boilers could fail, fires could break out, storms could drive ships from their course. Newspapers of the era often reported disasters at sea, ships lost with all hands, passengers drowned, voyages that ended in tragedy. Every traveller knew these risks, and yet they climbed aboard, compelled by necessity or curiosity, driven by duty or by dreams of distant horizons. When at last the ship reached its destination, the relief was immense. The sight of land after days or weeks at sea stirred cheers, tears, and hurried preparations. Trunks were packed, clothes brushed, hats straightened. As the vessel drew into harbour, passengers pressed against the rails, eager for the first glimpse of foreign shores, foreign shores. The air smelled different. The colours seemed sharper, and the cries of dockworkers, unfamiliar accents, and strange sights announced the beginning of a new chapter. Thus was the experience of crossing the seas in the Victorian age, a mixture of wonder and misery, beauty and discomfort, safety and danger. It was slower than we can now imagine, harder than many of us would bear, yet filled with moments that lingered in memory for a lifetime. To sail on a steamship was to be both trapped and free, confined within iron walls, yet carried across the endless waters to places that once seemed impossibly far away. And for those who endured the storms and sickness, there was always the reward of arrival, the joy of stepping once more on solid ground, and the knowledge that they had crossed the sea like true travellers of their age. Before a single mile of road or sea could be crossed, there was the matter of preparation. No Victorian journey began with a train whistle or a ship's horn. It began in the quiet, cluttered rooms of a household, surrounded by trunks, boxes, and endless decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. Packing in the 19th century was not a light affair. There were no lightweight suitcases with wheels, no collapsible bags, no sense of a travel light. To travel respectably was to carry one's life along in heavy leather trunks, polished wooden cases, and hat boxes, all designed to withstand rough handling, but adding enormous weight. Even a short trip of a few days could involve half a dozen pieces of luggage, while journeys overseas required entire mountain-like piles of possessions, enough to fill carts, or be hauled by porters straining under the load. Inside these trunks, the contents revealed the values of the age. Clothing was the largest portion, layers upon layers of garments, for men and women alike. A gentleman would pack shirts with stiff collars, waistcoats, coats for day and evening, trousers suitable for walking or riding, gloves, and of course a hat or two, carefully protected in its own case. A lady's requirements were even more demanding. Dresses for day wear, gowns for evening, outer cloaks, petticoats, stockings, ribbons, parasols, and bonnets with fragile trims that must not be crushed. The Victorian traveller believed deeply in the importance of appearance, even when halfway across the world, and so wardrobes were carried in miniature, carefully folded or rolled, with lavender sachets slipped between layers to keep away moths and preserve freshness. Alongside clothing came the smaller necessities. A shaving kit for the gentleman, complete with razor, brush and soap, sewing supplies for mending torn hems or loose buttons, small bottles of perfume or cologne, sometimes decanted into travel-sized flasks, fans for the heat, scarves for the cold, umbrellas for sudden rain. And then the endless variety of personal comforts, favourite books, writing paper and inkstands, family portraits framed in leather cases, small candlesticks to light a dark cabin, and even, on longer voyages, silver cutlery, teapots, or plates to ensure that one did not have to rely entirely on the rough tableware of inns or steamships. For the wealthier traveller, packing became almost an art form. There were specially designed trunks with drawers that pulled out like miniature wardrobes, compartments for shoes, slots for walking sticks and canes, velvet-lined boxes for jewellery, and cushioned spaces for delicate items like opera glasses or sketchbooks. Ladies carried travelling desks, small wooden boxes that opened to reveal compartments for ink, pens, stamps and envelopes so that correspondence could continue no matter where they found themselves. A journey without letter writing was unthinkable, for to be absent without sending word home was to risk fading from memory. Medicines were another essential. The Victorian age had not yet mastered modern health, and so the prudent traveller carried a small apothecary. Bottles of laudanum for pain, quinine for fevers, smelling salts for faintness, powders for stomach troubles, and bandages for cuts or bruises. For those bound overseas, especially to tropical climates, there were mosquito nets, cork helmets, and sometimes even small water filters, an attempt to guard against the dangers of heat, insects, and unclean supplies. To modern eyes, it may seem a great burden, but for the Victorian it was reassurance, a way to carry a small fortress of health against the unknown. Then came the question of books and entertainment. The railway journey of a few hours required only a newspaper or perhaps a slim novel. But on voyages lasting weeks, reading matter became precious. Travellers packed volumes of poetry, religious tracts, novels by Dickens or Thackeray, or scientific works to study by lamplight. Some brought sketchbooks and watercolours to capture the landscapes they might see. Children, too, were provided with their amusements: puzzles, cards, dolls and small toys that might pass the long days at sea. Without radio, cinema or recorded music, these quiet pursuits filled the hours and gave rhythm to the monotony. Packing was also a matter of servants. Wealthy families rarely carried their own trunks. They had porters, maids and valets who knew exactly how to fold garments, polish shoes or arrange toiletries. A lady's maid was indispensable, ensuring gowns were brushed and collars pressed even in the cramped cabins of a ship. A gentleman's valet kept track of boots, cufflinks, and the small routines of grooming that marked his social standing. These attendants were themselves packed into the journey, their presence assumed as naturally as the trunks they carried. The day before departure was often one of controlled chaos. Rooms filled with open trunks, garments laid out on beds, piles of books, papers and packages awaiting final decisions. Mothers fretted over what the children might need, fathers checked passports and tickets, servants scurried about carrying items to and fro. And always there was the worry of forgetting something vital: a favourite shawl, a pair of spectacles, a cherished letter. Diaries of the age often speak of sleepless nights before travel, minds turning over the endless lists of things to be remembered. At last the trunks were closed, straps tightened, locks fastened. Labels were attached with names and destinations carefully written in ink, for luggage could too easily be lost in the confusion of crowded stations or harbours. Porters arrived with carts, hauling the heavy loads down narrow staircases and out into the waiting carriages. Neighbours might watch from doorways, curious about the journey, while children called out farewells. The very sight of so much luggage announced a departure, and with it the sense of an adventure beginning. Thus, before a single mile of track or sea was crossed, the Victorian traveller had already endured the first trial of the journey, the labour of preparation. To pack was to confront the distance ahead, to imagine all the needs of weeks or months, and to shrink the comforts of home into a few heavy trunks. It was an exercise in patience, foresight and resignation, for no matter how carefully one packed, there was always something forgotten, something regretted, or something discovered to be unnecessary. In the end, to be a Victorian traveller was to carry not only one's possessions, but also the weight of custom, class and identity. Every trunk was a declaration of wealth, of taste, of respectability. And so, long before the train whistle or the ship's horn, the journey had already begun, among folded gowns, strapped boxes, and the endless question of what must be taken and what might be left behind. The road could be long, and the train ride even longer, but no matter how the Victorian traveller reached the next town, the end of the day always brought the same question: where shall I sleep tonight? Unlike our age of glowing booking apps and endless hotel reviews, the Victorians had only word of mouth, a local guidebook, or the simple act of stepping into the first building that looked respectable enough to provide food and shelter. Their choices were limited, yet in their very limitations lies the charm, and perhaps the discomfort of their experience. A weary traveller might approach a coaching inn, its sign creaking in the evening wind, promising rest for horses and humans alike. These inns were often placed at convenient distances along the main roads, so that a carriage could travel from one to the next before nightfall. But what the weary traveller discovered inside was not always what the polished sign outside suggested. Smoke from the common room fire drifted lazily into the hallways, and the air smelled of roast meat, mixed with damp wool, tobacco, and perhaps the faint scent of stale ale. Beds were promised, and beds were delivered, but the word "abede" itself covered a wide spectrum of realities. Sometimes it meant a straw-stuffed mattress, flattened by countless bodies before, squeaking under the slightest movement. Sometimes it meant a shared room, where strangers, snoring loudly, rolled about only a few feet away. Privacy was a luxury, and silence an impossibility. Even in better inns, the walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the night carried with it the restless noises of travellers, servants and animals kept in nearby stables. In larger towns, the Victorian traveller might find a proper hotel, rising proudly with its polished brass handles and grand staircases. These were the pride of the era, advertised in newspapers as modern, respectable and civilized. Yet even here, the experience was rarely the same as the promise. Rooms were small, sometimes dark, with narrow beds and heavy draperies that trapped dust. Washing facilities might consist of a single pitcher of cold water and a small porcelain basin on a wooden stand. The water, by morning, might already be tepid, and the idea of a hot bath was reserved only for the wealthy or the fortunate. Travellers often complained in their diaries of strange beds that were too short, so that tall men had to curl themselves awkwardly, or too narrow, so that one turn in the night left a sleeper half spilled onto the floor. There were stories of mattresses so lumpy that one might wake with an ache in the back as if they had slept on cobblestones, and pillows filled with feathers that smelled faintly of their former owners, the geese. Fun! Yet, to the exhausted body, even these inconveniences could provide some measure of comfort, and the rhythmic snores of strangers sometimes blurred into the dreamlike background of travel fatigue. Food in such places was as much a gamble as the bedding. A plate of mutton might arrive swimming in its own grease, or a stew that tasted faintly of yesterday's stew, and perhaps the day before's as well. Bread could be stale, beer watery, but hunger often dulled criticism, and many ate without complaint. For the traveller, the act of sitting at a wooden table by the glow of a dim oil lamp, sharing space with others who were equally tired, was part of the journey itself. The dull murmur of conversations in accents from different corners of the country, the clinking of cutlery, and the occasional laughter all blended into the timeless ritual of being far from home. Even the richest travellers could not always escape discomfort. Diaries of aristocrats reveal complaints of insects. Fleas and bedbugs were notorious companions in Victorian inns. Wealth bought more space, more servants, and perhaps fresher linens, but it could not always guarantee peace or cleanliness. Many a lady wrote letters home about her sleepless nights spent brushing away unseen creatures, or her horror at finding a suspicious stain on the coverlet. Gentlemen, though more resigned, sometimes joked about it, as though discomfort was part of the authentic adventure of travel. Yet alongside the discomforts were small pleasures. A kind innkeeper might offer an extra blanket on a cold night. A cheerful maid might hum as she brought a tray of bread and cheese. A roaring fire in the common room might soothe even the most road-weary guest. And the act of falling asleep, however restless, was always softened by the knowledge that tomorrow promised new sights, new roads, and new stories to collect. For the Victorian traveller, inns and hotels were never merely about sleep. They were waypoints, chapters in the story of the journey, places where human lives briefly intersected before parting ways again. A shared room might mean a new acquaintance, perhaps a fellow traveller with tales of distant lands. A restless night might mean a memorable anecdote to retell. Even the lumpy beds and stale bread became part of the mosaic of travel, a reminder that comfort was fleeting, but experience endured. And so, as the night deepened, and the fire in the common room burned low, travellers lay down on mattresses that were too hard or too soft, listened to the chorus of snores, coughed at the dust in the curtains, and drifted into sleep. Their dreams, if they came, were filled with the rhythm of the road, the rocking of the carriage, the whistle of a train, or the distant roll of the sea. By morning, the beds would be abandoned, the tables wiped, and the travellers gone, leaving only the faint impression of countless bodies who had rested there before. To travel in the Victorian age was not only to move from place to place, but also to face the daily puzzle of eating along the way. Unlike our own world of cafes at every corner and railway buffets stocked with sandwiches, the Victorian traveller had to accept whatever could be found, or more often, endure whatever was placed before him. Food on the road was rarely about taste or pleasure. It was about sustenance, about keeping the body strong enough for the next stage of the journey. At the simplest inns, the menu was not a list but an inevitability. A traveller asked for a meal and received whatever the cook had managed to prepare that day, which was often the same as the day before. Stews were common, heavy with root vegetables, their flavours blending together into a kind of comforting monotony. Meat, if it was available, came salted or boiled, sometimes roasted, but always cooked until no trace of tenderness remained. Bread, more often stale than fresh, was served in thick, uneven slices, its hardness softened only by dipping it into broth or beer. Railway stations slowly introduced refreshment rooms meant to feed crowds quickly between trains, yet these were often ridiculed for their meagre offerings. Cold pies with crusts hard enough to crack a tooth, slices of ham that were more fat than meat, and lukewarm tea poured into cups that smelled faintly of the last passenger's drink. Some travellers wrote in their diaries of dashing into these rooms only to find long queues, hurried attendants, and food so unappetizing that hunger seemed the safer choice. There was even a kind of grim humour in these complaints. Everyone knew what to expect, and so the poor quality became part of the ritual of travel itself. For those travelling by coach, food meant stopping at a roadside inn, where horses were watered and passengers were hurried inside. Here the food was often hastily prepared, served on chipped plates, with little time to linger. A traveller might be handed a plate of boiled beef, a cup of beer, and told to hurry, for the coach would not wait. The clatter of forks, the scraping of benches, the smell of stewed cabbage, all became part of the sensory memory of the road. The wealthier traveller fared a little better. In grander hotels of cities and larger towns, dining rooms offered multi-course meals, complete with soups, roasts, and puddings. These were not necessarily more refined in flavour, but they carried the appearance of sophistication, silver cutlery, candlelight, and uniformed waiters. For those who could afford them, such meals were part of the performance of travel, a way of assuring oneself that one remained respectable, even far from home. Yet even the wealthiest could not always escape disappointment. Fish that smelled faintly of the sea in all the wrong ways, puddings that were heavy and bland, sauces that overwhelmed rather than enhanced, the complaints filled letters home and travelogues alike. But for every complaint there was also a kind of acceptance. One did not travel in the Victorian age expecting culinary delight. One travelled expecting to be fed, and that was enough. Still, there were small joys along the way. A fresh apple bought from a roadside stall, its crispness a relief after days of salted meats. A warm loaf of bread taken from a village baker, its crust golden and fragrant, eaten while walking through cobbled streets. A pot of tea brewed properly, hot and strong, in a quiet inn where the fire crackled nearby. These moments, though simple, could linger longer in memory than any grand hotel feast. Travelling families sometimes packed their own provisions. Baskets filled with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and jars of jam provided comfort against the uncertainties of road food. Children especially looked forward to these picnics, taken in train compartments or roadside meadows, where the food seemed to taste better simply because it was familiar. Diaries describe the delight of unwrapping a carefully packed slice of cake while the train rattled on, the crumbs scattering onto laps and seats, and the simple sweetness making up for all the dull meals endured elsewhere. Food on the road was, in essence, a mirror of the journey itself, sometimes bland, sometimes unpleasant, but dotted with moments of quiet satisfaction. It required patience, acceptance, and a willingness to find pleasure in the smallest of flavours. For the Victorian traveller, every meal was a reminder that the comforts of home were far away, yet also that the experience of travel was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be endured, remembered, and retold and retold. And so they ate their stews, their stale bread, their pies and puddings, washing it down with weak beer or lukewarm tea before stepping back onto carriages, trains, or ships. The meals were never the highlight, but they were part of the rhythm, the steady heartbeat of travel life. In their very ordinariness lay the peculiar charm of the road, the knowledge that, though food might not delight, it sustained, and that was all a traveller truly needed. To travel in the Victorian age was never a solitary affair, even for those who desired solitude most keenly. The journey itself, whether by coach, train or ship, placed men and women side by side, forcing strangers into close quarters for hours, days, sometimes even weeks. It was in these cramped compartments, shared dining tables, and narrow cabins that the Victorian traveller learned to endure not only the bumps of the road, but also the company of unfamiliar souls. Carriages, for instance, were small theatres of social observation. 6 or 8 passengers might be pressed together, their knees almost touching, the air heavy with damp coats and the faint smell of tobacco. Here, silence was not always possible. Some travellers attempted polite conversation, beginning with predictable remarks about the weather, the lateness of the coach, or the poor quality of the roads. Others preferred to retreat behind a newspaper, though the rustle of pages was sometimes as intrusive as speech. a speech, and there were always those who snored, their heads lolling uncomfortably against the glass to the irritation of their fellow passengers. Railway compartments carried the same enforced intimacy. Diaries describe how 2 or 3 strangers, after a few hours of shared travel, would know one another's habits in remarkable detail. The sound of a cough, the way a man folded his gloves, or the particular sharpness of a lady's perfume. Sometimes these brief acquaintances ended in genuine friendships, with addresses exchanged and promises of letters. More often, they ended with nothing more than a polite bow at the platform and a silent relief that the journey together was over. On ships, encounters with strangers could not be so easily avoided. Shared dining rooms and crowded decks meant that one soon grew accustomed to the same faces, the same half-familiar nods. Seasickness often stripped away formality, leaving passengers pale and vulnerable, their dignity abandoned over the railings. In these moments, strangers sometimes became reluctant companions in suffering, offering one another water, handkerchiefs, or simply the comfort of silent understanding. Yet the Victorian traveller was cautious by nature. Strangers were potential sources of amusement, but also of inconvenience. Letters and journals reveal frequent complaints. The talkative seatmate who would not allow silence, the child who kicked legs against the bench, the gentleman who insisted on smoking despite others' protests, the lady who carried too many parcels and expected help at every turn. Such irritations were part of the texture of travel, as familiar as the sound of wheels turning or the rocking of a carriage. And still, there were the moments of unexpected kindness. A stranger sharing a sandwich on a long train ride, a fellow passenger offering a blanket when the night air grew too cold, a quiet conversation that filled the hours of a dark journey with surprising warmth. These encounters, brief and fleeting, reminded travellers that, though the world was filled with strangers, it was also filled with the possibility of small human connection. Some travellers cherished the anonymity of strangers. In diaries, they wrote of the freedom to speak openly with those they would never meet again, confiding thoughts they might not dare share at home. Others dreaded it, keeping their eyes fixed on the window, counting the miles until they could escape into solitude once more. But whether cherished or endured, encounters with strangers were unavoidable. They were the background hum of Victorian travel, the voices and faces that came and went, like stations along a line, like shadows on a ship's deck, like figures glimpsed on a dusty road. For every irritation, there was the memory of a brief smile, a shared laugh, a companionable silence. And when the journey ended and the traveller returned home, it was often these strangers, half forgotten, yet curiously vivid, who lingered in memory long after the roads and landscapes themselves had faded. Travel in the Victorian age, though clothed in the romance of adventure and discovery, was rarely comfortable and never entirely safe. Beneath the outward civility of railway compartments and the grandeur of steamships lay a world of hazards, both great and small, that every traveller had to endure. To journey was, in many ways, to accept discomfort as a companion. The roads themselves were often treacherous. In the earlier part of the century, before railways stitched the land together, carriages rattled along uneven tracks that turned to rivers of mud in the rain and clouds of dust in the summer heat. Wheels broke, axles snapped, and horses stumbled, sending passengers into ditches or leaving them stranded in desolate places. Even when the coach did not fail, the journey could bruise and jolt, shaking the body as if it were little more than cargo. Diaries speak of aching backs, numb legs and headaches that lingered long after arrival. Railways promised greater speed and smoother travel, but they carried their own dangers. Early trains were not without accidents. Boilers could explode, carriages could derail, and collisions, though rare, were catastrophic when they came. The sensation of moving at 30 miles an hour, a pace that seemed impossibly fast to many Victorians, was both exhilarating and unnerving. Some passengers wrote of dizziness, nausea, or a strange pounding in the ears. Others feared that such speed might damage the human body itself, shaking organs from their proper place or straining the mind beyond endurance. Ships, too, were no sanctuary. Sheer storms swept across the decks, tossing passengers from their bunks, drenching cabins with seawater, and leaving all aboard helpless before the might of the sea. Seasickness was so common, it became almost a rite of passage. Few could escape the misery of it, and even the most seasoned travellers found themselves humbled by the relentless swell. In darker accounts, disease spread quickly in cramped quarters, turning a voyage into a floating infirmary where hope depended on little more than endurance. Beyond the physical dangers lay the threats of theft and misfortune. Pickpockets haunted crowded stations and inns, preying on the weary and the distracted. Luggage, once entrusted to porters or tied to carriage roofs, could vanish without a trace. Some travellers wrote bitterly of arriving at their destination only to find their belongings misplaced or pilfered, their carefully packed trunks reduced to nothing more than empty boxes. Illness, too, lurked in every unfamiliar bed and meal. The water of one town might unsettle a traveller's stomach. The food of another might bring on fevers or cramps. Beds in country inns carried fleas, lice or worse, and even the most fastidious traveller could not entirely avoid them. For those of delicate health, the mere act of travel could provoke relapses, leaving them confined to strange rooms far from home. And yet, for all these dangers and discomforts, Victorians continued to travel. They accepted the risks as part of the experience, part of the story that would be told upon return. Indeed, in many cases, the very discomforts became memories more vivid than the landscapes themselves. The storm survived, the sleepless night endured, the train delayed for hours in the rain. These were the threads that wove travel into something more than motion, something that tested patience, courage, and resilience. For some, the dangers were exaggerated in their minds, looming larger than reality. For others, they were badges of honour, proof that the traveller had braved the world beyond the quiet walls of home. And though the discomforts were countless, cold, hunger, noise, fatigue, they gave the journey its texture, its weight. Without them, travel would have been little more than movement. With them, it became experience. For the Victorian traveller, no matter how far the road stretched or how many seas were crossed, there was always the pull of home. Travel was often measured not only in miles but in the ink of letters, written by flickering lamplight in railway inns, scribbled on the deck of a swaying ship, or carefully composed in quiet hotel rooms where the smell of foreign cooking drifted through the shutters. Letters were the lifeline that connected wanderer to hearth. They carried news, affection, complaints and confessions, bridging the distance between the known and the unknown. Some travellers wrote daily, their handwriting neat and precise, filling page after page with observations of landscapes, train timetables, and the quality of the bread at breakfast. Others wrote rarely, sending home only a hurried note when opportunity allowed, apologising for silence and promising more in the next post. The tone of these letters varied as widely as the travellers themselves. Some were filled with wonder. Descriptions of wide rivers, grand cathedrals and bustling streets, all set down in detail for the family who might never see such sights themselves. Children at home waited eagerly for these letters, gathering around as they were read aloud, their imaginations carried to distant places they could scarcely picture. Others, however, wrote with frustration. Endless delays, poor food, uncomfortable beds, seasickness and rude strangers. These too filled the pages, turning the letter into something more like a complaint than a tale of adventure. Yet even these grumblings had their own comfort, for they revealed that the absent father, brother or daughter still thought enough of home to share their troubles. There were letters of longing too. Some travellers confessed how deeply they missed the familiar creak of their own door, the sound of the church bell in their village, or the taste of a simple home-cooked meal. To travel was to see and to endure, but also to ache quietly for the small comforts of one's own corner of the world, sown corner of the world. These letters, often softened by tears before they ever reached the post, carried with them the truest heart of travel, the reminder that distance sharpens affection. For families at home, receiving a letter was almost as much of a journey as writing one. Days or weeks might pass between postings, and so every arrival was an event. The letter would be opened carefully, the ink scanned eagerly, and the words read aloud again and again. They were passed from hand to hand, folded and refolded, sometimes kept in pockets or tucked under pillows, as if holding the page itself might bring the traveller nearer. Yet not every letter reached its destination. Ships sank, coaches overturned, mail bags were stolen, and sometimes the paper simply vanished into the vast system of Victorian post. Families waited in growing anxiety, counting the days, wondering at the silence. The absence of a letter was as eloquent as its presence, sometimes heavier, sometimes unbearable. Still, for most, letters were the voice of travel. They captured the weariness, the wonder, the petty irritations, and the quiet joys of the road. And though travellers might return with souvenirs, China cups, painted fans, pressed flowers, it was the stack of letters, tied in ribbon or tucked into boxes, that held the truest record of the journey. In these letters home, Victorian travel became something more than roads and rails. It became words carried across distance, words that turned experience into memory, and memory into something that could be shared. And in the end, perhaps that was travel's greatest gift. Not the miles walked or the seas crossed, but the stories carried home in ink and paper, safe in the hearts of those who had never left their own fireside. No Victorian journey was considered complete without something to bring back, a token, a memento, a small object that could carry the weight of memory. These keepsakes were more than curiosities. They were proof of distance travelled, evidence of worlds beyond the familiar street or parish. For the traveller, they preserved moments that might otherwise fade, and for those at home, they offered a tangible piece of the adventure. Sometimes, souvenirs were humble. A smooth stone picked from a riverbank, a shell carried from a foreign shore, or a pressed flower tucked carefully between the pages of a guidebook. These were fragile treasures, the kind that spoke not of wealth, but of sentiment. They reminded the traveller of a walk taken at dusk, of the sound of waves, of the scent of meadows now far behind. Other keepsakes were more elaborate. A porcelain teacup purchased in a bustling port, a silk fan painted with delicate birds, or a miniature model of a cathedral carved from wood. Shops near railway stations and steamship docks did brisk trade in such goods, knowing that travellers longed to return home with something in hand. These objects often took pride of place on mantelpieces, where visitors could admire them and hear, once again, the tale of how they were acquired. Books and prints, too, found their way into luggage. A traveller might buy a local history pamphlet, a map, or even a small sketch made by an artist encountered along the road. Some, skilled with pencil themselves, drew their own souvenirs, quick sketches of buildings or landscapes, not for art's sake but to capture memory in lines and shading. Yet not all keepsakes were purchased. Some were accidental. A railway ticket kept in a pocket, later discovered with a smile, a menu card from a hotel, a playbill from a theatre visited on a whim. These scraps of paper, valueless to anyone else, became treasures when folded into letters or tucked into drawers at home. They whispered of journeys and places in a language only the traveller fully understood. And then there were the more unusual mementos. Locks of hair exchanged with strangers met on the road, a coin pressed into a palm as a farewell gift, or even the scent of a foreign perfume lingering on a handkerchief. Each was a keepsake of a different sort, intimate, private, bound to memory as tightly as to the object itself. For families at home, souvenirs were eagerly awaited. Children begged for exotic trinkets, a toy soldier from Paris, a seashell from Brighton, or a sweet not found in their own shops. Wives looked forward to lengths of fabric or bits of jewellery, while husbands welcomed pipes, books, or curiosities to display in their studies. When the trunk was finally opened after a journey, the unwrapping of these keepsakes was almost as thrilling as the tales themselves. But perhaps the greatest keepsakes were not material at all. They were the impressions carried in the mind. The way a city smelled at dawn, the feeling of cold air rushing through a train window, the sight of a foreign sunset. Objects could break, fade, or be misplaced, but these inner souvenirs lingered long after. In the end, souvenirs and keepsakes were less about possession than about preservation. They held the power to turn a fleeting moment into something lasting, to anchor memory in the physical world. For the Victorians, who often saw travel as something extraordinary, these small tokens were reminders that the extraordinary could indeed be held in the palm of the hand. Not every Victorian adventure was a grand crossing of oceans or a trek across the continent. Sometimes the most memorable travels were the smaller ones, the quiet detours, the unplanned wanderings, the little journeys that nestled inside the greater voyage. These were the pauses between destinations, the unexpected stops that gave shape and colour to the wider road. A traveller might set out to reach London by train, but along the way there would be a halt at a small town station. With an hour to spare before the next connection, the traveller would step out, wander into narrow cobbled streets, peer into a local shop, or perhaps taste a pastry from a vendor's tray. That hour, though unplanned, became a journey of its own, a pocket of memory distinct from the grand itinerary. Inns and coaching stops often became the stage for such journeys. A weary passenger, stepping down from the jolting coach, would find themselves in a village unknown, greeted by curious glances of locals. A short walk to stretch one's legs might reveal a hidden church, a market square, or even a glimpse of countryside more peaceful than the miles of road just endured. By the time the coach horn blew again, the traveller carried away a small story, a memory not marked on any map. There were also chance encounters, meeting a fellow passenger on a boat who shared stories of distant lands, or striking up conversation with a stranger on a railway platform. These exchanges might last only a few minutes, but in the memory of the traveller, they often lived longer than the official sights. Journeys within journeys were measured not in miles, but in moments, a smile, a sentence, a kindness offered by someone never seen again. Even in the great cities, the same pattern appeared. A traveller in Paris might slip away from the grand boulevards to wander a quiet back alley where children played with wooden hoops, or in Rome stray from the ruins to find a small cafe filled with the smell of roasted coffee. These digressions, accidental or deliberate, were like secret chambers hidden within the palace of travel. And sometimes the smallest journeys were the most personal. The walk from a noisy inn room down to the stables, the stroll to a riverside at dusk, or the quiet moment leaning out of a carriage window to breathe in the evening air. These were not recorded in guidebooks, nor praised in letters home, but they stitched together the larger tapestry of the road, giving warmth and texture to the vast stretches of time spent travelling. For the Victorians, whose journeys were often long and exhausting, these smaller adventures offered rest, surprise and joy. They reminded the traveller that every road contained other roads, every destination other destinations, and that travel was not only about reaching a place, but also about discovering what unfolded along the way. In truth, a journey within a journey was like a story within a story. Brief, quiet and easily overlooked, yet carrying its own richness. And when the larger travels were long forgotten, it was often these small fragments that lingered most clearly in memory. The pastry tasted at a country fair, the kind words of a stranger, the sudden sight of a sunset through a train window. To travel alone in the Victorian age was already an adventure, filled with uncertainties and discoveries. But to travel with family, that was a different kind of voyage altogether. It meant not only carrying one's own luggage and burdens, but also the needs, whims, and tempers of loved ones. What could be a simple journey became, in the company of family, something like a moving household on the road. Parents often worried most about their children. Long hours in a swaying carriage or stuffy railway compartment tested the patience of even the calmest child. Little ones grew restless, asked endless questions, and demanded food or drink at the most inconvenient moments. Mothers packed baskets full of bread, fruit, and boiled sweets to quiet small mouths, while fathers did their best to keep order, sometimes pretending to read the newspaper while secretly listening for quarrels. For children, however, the journey was a wonder. Every stop, every sight outside the window, every whistle of the engine was an event. They pressed their noses to glass, pointed at cows in fields, and marvelled at the strange shapes of mountains or the endless stretch of the sea. Where parents saw discomfort, children often saw adventure. Grandparents, too, sometimes joined these travels, bringing with them a slower pace. A grandmother might fuss over blankets and shawls, worrying about draughts, while a grandfather told stories of travels from earlier days, turning each station or inn into a stage for reminiscence. Their presence added both warmth and weight to the journey, comforting but also demanding care and patience. Brothers and sisters travelling together often carried the familiar rivalries of home into the carriage or cabin. Seats were fought over, parcels misplaced, and small disputes broke out with regularity. Yet there were also moments of laughter. Siblings sharing a pastry, pointing out curious sights, or whispering jokes as the countryside rolled past. Larger families turned entire coaches or compartments into noisy theatres of life. Nurses or governesses might be brought along to keep order, while trunks of clothing, toys, and blankets filled the available space. Other travellers sometimes sighed at the disruption, yet just as often they smiled, for family journeys, though chaotic, were filled with life. There were also tender moments. A father lifting a child to see the ocean for the first time. A mother soothing a tired little one with a lullaby as the train rattled through the night. A family gathering together in prayer before a long sea crossing. these memories stayed with children long after the discomforts were forgotten. But travelling with family was not without risk. Seasickness could spread quickly through a household on a stormy voyage, leaving parents struggling to care for ill children while managing their own sickness. Lost luggage caused great distress, especially when it contained precious toys or necessary clothing. Delays tested tempers, and crowded inns sometimes forced families into strange arrangements, 3 or 4 squeezed into a single bed chamber, trying to rest while the walls shook with noise from below. Still, despite the trials, family journeys were treasured. They created bonds forged in shared discomforts and shared delights. Years later, adults would remember not only the great monuments they had seen, but also the small details, the way their mother's hands packed food, the sound of their father's voice reading aloud by candlelight, or the laughter of a sibling when the carriage hit a bump in the road. In truth, to travel with family was to carry a little world along with you, one that clashed, quarrelled, comforted, and loved in equal measure. And when the journey ended, the stories told around the fire were not just of distant places, but of the family itself, how it had moved as one through the trials and joys of the road. In the age before telephones, before telegrams were common, a journey was always shadowed by distance, not only in miles, but in silence. For the Victorians, the thread that tied traveller to home was the humble letter. Ink on paper carried across seas, over mountains, and through the rattling mail coaches was the lifeline that kept families and friends close, even when separated by great distance. Travellers often carried with them neat bundles of stationery, folded sheets of fine paper, bottles of ink, and pens carefully wrapped. In quiet moments at an inn, or while waiting for a ship to sail, they would sit by candlelight and pour their thoughts onto paper. The letter might begin stiffly, reporting on health and safe arrival, but soon it wandered into details, the discomfort of the coach, the strange manners of fellow passengers, the sight of a mountain or cathedral, the taste of food unlike any at home. For the family left behind, these letters were treasures. Mothers read them aloud to younger children. Fathers examined the handwriting as though it carried some trace of the traveller's presence. News from the road was eagerly awaited, and delays in the post caused real anxiety. Weeks might pass before a letter written in Paris or Vienna found its way to a cottage in Yorkshire, and by then the traveller might already have moved on. Yet the words still breathed life across the gap, allowing home and journey to meet on the fragile surface of a page. Some travellers took pride in their letters, crafting them almost as works of art. Descriptions of foreign landscapes or bustling cities were written in flowing prose, full of detail, as though they were painting with ink. Others were practical, listing expenses, reporting on weather, or promising to return soon. But every letter, no matter how simple, carried with it the scent of distance and the comfort of connection. Posting a letter was not always easy. In small villages, the traveller might need to wait until market day to find a messenger or a passing coach. In foreign lands, language barriers made it difficult to locate the post office or understand the system. On ships, letters were entrusted to captains, who would deliver them when the vessel next reached port. Sometimes they were lost to storms, mislaid in sorting rooms, or delayed by wars and strikes. Each arrival, then, felt like a small miracle. There was also the joy of receiving letters while abroad. A traveller arriving in a distant city would eagerly check the post restant, that special service where letters were held until called for. The sight of familiar handwriting on an envelope could bring tears of relief. To read words from home, penned weeks before, was to feel less alone in a strange land. Letters carried more than information. They carried emotion. A daughter's cheerful description of a carriage ride, a father's stern advice sent across borders, a lover's tender words sealed with wax, all these turned paper into something living. The traveller might fold the sheet carefully, tuck it into a pocket, and read it again and again until the ink grew faint from handling. In time, many of these letters became family heirlooms, stored in boxes or pressed between books. Long after the journeys themselves were over, the letters survived as traces of roads travelled, seas crossed, and lives lived at a distance. For future generations, they told not only where their ancestors had gone, but how they had felt, the weariness, the wonder, the longing for home. Thus, in the Victorian world, to write a letter was itself a journey, one that began with a pen scratching across paper and ended in the embrace of a distant reader. And so, even when miles of separation lay between them, the traveller and the family at home remained bound together by words that refused to be silenced by distance. In the age before telephones, before telegrams were common, a journey was always shadowed by distance, not only in miles but in silence. For the Victorians, the thread that tied traveller to home was the humble letter. Ink on paper carried across seas, over mountains, and through the rattling mail coaches was the lifeline that kept families and friends close, even when separated by great distance. Travellers often carried with them neat bundles of stationery, folded sheets of fine paper, bottles of ink, and pens carefully wrapped. In quiet moments at an inn, or while waiting for a ship to sail, they would sit by candlelight and pour their thoughts onto paper. The letter might begin stiffly, reporting on health and safe arrival, but soon it wandered into details: the discomfort of the coach, the strange manners of fellow passengers, the sight of a mountain or cathedral, the taste of food unlike any at home. For the family left behind, these letters were treasures. Mothers read them aloud to younger children. Fathers examined the handwriting as though it carried some trace of the traveller's presence. News from the road was eagerly awaited, and delays in the post caused real anxiety. Weeks might pass before a letter written in Paris or Vienna found its way to a cottage in Yorkshire, and by then the traveller might already have moved on. Yet the words still breathed life across the gap, allowing home and journey to meet on the fragile surface of a page. Some travellers took pride in their letters, crafting them almost as works of art. Descriptions of foreign landscapes or bustling cities were written in flowing prose, full of detail, as though they were painting with ink. Others were practical, listing expenses, reporting on weather, or promising to return soon. But every letter, no matter how simple, carried with it the scent of distance and the comfort of connection. Posting a letter was not always easy. In small villages, the traveller might need to wait until market day to find a messenger or a passing coach. In foreign lands, language barriers made it difficult to locate the post office or understand the system. On ships, letters were entrusted to captains, who would deliver them when the vessel next reached port. Sometimes they were lost to storms, mislaid in sorting rooms, or delayed by wars and strikes. Each arrival, then, felt like a small miracle. There was also the joy of receiving letters while abroad. A traveller arriving in a distant city would eagerly check the post restant, that special service where letters were held until called for. The sight of familiar handwriting on an envelope could bring tears of relief. To read words from home, penned weeks before, was to feel less alone in a strange land. Letters carried more than information. They carried emotion. A daughter's cheerful description of a carriage ride, a father's stern advice sent across borders, a lover's tender words sealed with wax, all these turned paper into something living. The traveller might fold the sheet carefully, tuck it into a pocket, and read it again and again until the ink grew faint from handling. In time, many of these letters became family heirlooms, stored in boxes or pressed between books. Long after the journeys themselves were over, the letters survived as traces of roads travelled, seas crossed, and lives lived at a distance. For future generations, they told not only where their ancestors had gone, but how they had felt: the weariness, the wonder, the longing for home. Thus, in the Victorian world, to write a letter was itself a journey, one that began with a pen scratching across paper and ended in the embrace of a distant reader. And so, even when miles of separation lay between them, the traveller and the family at home remained bound together by words that refused to be silenced by distance. For the Victorian traveller, the world was both vast and mysterious, and the surest companions on the road were maps and guidebooks, yet these companions were not always trustworthy. In fact, the more one relied on them, the more one discovered how fragile human knowledge could be when stretched across mountains, rivers, and foreign towns. Guidebooks became immensely popular in the 19th century. Small enough to slip into a pocket, these little volumes promised to reveal everything a traveller might need. The history of a cathedral, the best inn in a market town, the hours of a museum, even the price of a carriage ride. Names like Murray's Handbooks and Baedeker became trusted brands, their red and blue covers spotted in the hands of tourists across Europe. For many Victorians, to travel without such a book felt reckless, as though stepping onto the road blindfolded. But guidebooks, though thorough, had their limits. Information grew outdated quickly, and in praised for its comfort in one edition might by the next year have fallen into disrepair. A must-see attraction could be closed for renovations, leaving visitors disappointed. Some places were described with an air of authority, even when the writer had never visited them, details borrowed second-hand from rumour-older texts. And always the traveller had to contend with the gap between words on a page and the stubborn reality of streets and landscapes. And maps, too, carried both promise and peril. Folded neatly into cases, they gave the impression of order, of clarity. Roads stretched like veins across the paper, rivers curved like ribbons, cities were reduced to neat black dots. Yet when unfolded on a windy hillside or in the rattling interior of a coach, a map could seem a puzzle more than a solution. Roads shown as smooth lines might in truth be muddy tracks. Distances that looked manageable on paper could mean days of hard travel. In foreign lands, names on maps were often misspelled or mistranslated, confusing even the most careful reader. Travellers often discovered the danger of too much faith in these guides. A family following instructions to a celebrated inn might arrive to find it shuttered, its signs swinging mournfully in the wind. A tourist tracing the map's neat road might end up in a marsh, boots sinking into the muck. There were even stories of travellers wandering for hours in the Alps, their maps leading them toward paths that had never truly existed. And yet, part of the charm of travel lay in these very misdirections. To be lost was to discover. A wrong turn might lead to a quiet village untouched by tourists, or to a view grander than any mentioned in the guidebook. Some travellers began to trust less in paper and more in people, asking locals for directions, listening to stories, and finding their way by instinct and chance. Still, most Victorians clung to their books and maps, marking them with notes in the margins, folding and unfolding them until the creases wore thin. These objects became travel diaries in themselves, filled with ink smudges, penciled corrections, and the faint stains of rain. Unfaint stains of rain. To hold a used guidebook years later was to retrace one's own footsteps, as though the map had absorbed not just roads and towns, but the very spirit of the journey. In the end, guides and maps were less about accuracy and more about reassurance. They gave travellers the courage to step into the unknown, to believe that the world could be measured, described, and understood. Even when wrong, they served their purpose. They kept people moving forward, onward toward discovery, with only a little ink and paper as their compass. For all its discomforts, the jolting carriages, the smoky train compartments, the damp inns with lumpy beds, Victorian travel carried a strange and irresistible magic. Beneath the grime of dust and the ache of weary limbs lay something deeper, the romance of the open road. To set out from home was to step into possibility. Each mile carried with it the sense of freedom, of escape from the familiar. The world stretched wide before the traveller, filled with landscapes that seemed painted by unseen hands, rolling green hills in the English countryside, endless fields of golden wheat in France, mountain passes where the air grew thin and sharp. To move through such places was to feel oneself small yet alive, caught between the solid earth beneath one's boots and the boundless sky above. The Victorians, raised on poetry and novels, saw travel not only as movement, but as transformation. The road became a metaphor. To travel was to grow, to shed old selves and gather new ones along the way. A merchant leaving London for Paris might imagine himself an adventurer. A young woman travelling with family through Italy might return with a heart forever tied to its art and sunlight. Even the ordinary clerk, who managed a brief seaside holiday, could return with stories that gave his life a shimmer of adventure. There was also the simple joy of unpredictability. No two journeys were the same. A sudden rainstorm could turn a dull day's march into an unforgettable memory. A chance meeting with a stranger could alter the course of an entire trip. In such moments, the road revealed its true character. Not a fixed line on a map, but a living path that surprised and reshaped those who walked it. Poets and essayists of the era wrote of this romance with long. They described the thrill of standing at the edge of a foreign city, its streets unknown, its language strange, and knowing that discovery lay just beyond the next corner. They praised the solitude of a quiet country lane, where a traveller might hear nothing but the crunch of boots and the song of birds, and they celebrated the bond formed between companions on the road, friendships forged in laughter, in hardship, in shared awe at sights both grand and humble. They're both grand and humble. Even discomfort became part of the romance. To remember a sleepless night in a draughty inn was to remember, too, the excitement that had carried one there. To recall a missed train was to laugh at the chase across cobbled streets. These flaws in hindsight became ornaments to the story, making the journey more real, more human. The Victorians carried this romance home with them. In parlours and libraries, in journals and letters, they preserved not just facts of their journeys but the feeling of them, the exhilaration of departure, the wonder of arrival, the sweet melancholy of return. The sweet melancholy of return. For many, the open road became a symbol of life itself, a path always stretching forward, uncertain yet irresistible. And so, while travel tested the body, it nourished the soul. It promised that beyond every horizon lay something worth seeking, beauty, knowledge, adventure, or simply the joy of moving forward. This was the romance that made travellers forget their discomforts, that sent them again and again into the unknown, chasing not just destinations, but the road itself. Road itself. In an age before the telephone, before telegrams became cheap enough for everyday use, the most precious thread that bound the Victorian traveller to home was the letter. Every journey produced them, folded neatly into envelopes, their ink still damp from hurried pens. From hurried pens. For those who wandered far, the act of writing was both a duty and a comfort, a way of carrying home along the road and of sending pieces of oneself back across the miles. Letters home were never simple records. They were part confession, part performance. A son writing from Italy would not only describe the sunlit ruins of Rome, but also reassure his mother of his health, hiding the stomach sickness that plagued him. A daughter visiting Paris with her family would detail the glitter of the boulevards, omitting the fatigue that came with endless social calls. Travellers shaped their words carefully, aware that each sheet of paper might be read aloud in parlours, passed between siblings, even saved for years in small wooden boxes. The letters often carried the thrill of discovery. "I have seen the Alps," one might begin, or "We crossed the sea in a storm so wild that I thought the ship would break." Yet they also spoke of the mundane, the tiny details of meals eaten, rooms slept in, strangers encountered. To those at home, far from the journey, such details were treasures. They transformed foreign lands into something familiar, as though one might travel simply by reading. There was also a rhythm to correspondence. The traveller would write in haste, then wait for a reply that might take weeks or months. In this way, letters became conversations stretched across oceans. A question asked in April might not be answered until June. The delay made every letter an event, every arrival a moment of suspense. Families would gather around the post, breath held, until at last the envelope was torn open and the traveller's hand appeared in loops of ink. For some, letters were lifelines. A young man abroad for work might cling to his mother's letters as reminders of affection in a world that felt cold. A wife travelling with her children might pour her loneliness into lines addressed to a husband still at the office in London. In these words, separated by distance, love endured. Yet letters could also wound. The traveller who received news of illness or worse of death found the distance unbearable. To know but not to act, to be far when one longed to be near, was a pain sharper than any discomfort of the road. There are countless Victorian stories of travellers rushing home upon reading such a letter, carriages and trains becoming instruments of grief as they raced against time. Despite these sorrows, the letter remained a central part of travel. It gave shape to memory, turning fleeting impressions into permanent words. Many travellers kept copies of their own letters, which later became memoirs, guidebooks, even novels. Without such letters, much of what we know of Victorian travel, the sights, the emotions, the very feel of the journey, would be lost. In the end, every letter was both bridge and anchor, a bridge that spanned the distance between traveller and home, and an anchor that held the traveller steady in unfamiliar lands. To write was to remember where one had come from, and to promise, silently, that one would return. No Victorian journey was complete without the gathering of mementos. For travellers of the 19th century, it was not enough to see the world. They longed to bring it home, to hold in their hands proof of where they had been, to show others that the wide road had carried them beyond the familiar streets of their youth. These keepsakes, however humble or grand, became vessels of memory. Some were simple, plucked from nature. A shell found on a French shore, a smooth pebble from a Scottish loch, a pressed flower carefully tucked between the pages of a journal. These small treasures carried with them the scents and colours of distant places, reminders of landscapes that might never be seen again. Travellers would press a rose from an Italian garden or a fern from a Welsh hillside, treating these fragile remains as though they were sacred relics. Others collected objects that spoke of culture and craft. Markets were irresistible. Stalls crowded with carved trinkets, embroidered cloths, polished beads, or clay figurines. A young couple on their honeymoon in Switzerland might purchase a painted cowbell. A businessman in India might return with brass ornaments or ivory carvings. Each object told a story, not just of the land where it was made, but of the moment of purchase, the smile of a vendor, the haggling over price. Souvenirs also reflected status. Wealthy travellers often returned with art, antiques, or books bound in foreign languages. Shipping crates filled with marble busts, Persian carpets, or Japanese ceramics crossed oceans, destined to sit in the parlours of London and Manchester, where they would impress visitors and spark conversation. To display such things was to announce one's worldliness, to declare, "I have been where you have not." But keepsakes were not always objects of beauty. Some were oddities: a piece of volcanic rock from Vesuvius, a rusted nail from a ruined abbey, even bones or fossils picked up during country walks. These eccentric collections filled cabinets of curiosity, the prized corners of many Victorian homes. To the collector, such items were fragments of history itself, tangible proof that the world was ancient and mysterious. Travellers also carried with them keepsakes of the heart. A ticket stub from a steamship voyage, a hotel receipt scribbled with foreign ink, even the seal from a wine bottle opened in good company. All these small scraps, easily overlooked, became tokens of cherished moments. They might never be shown to others, yet they were kept safe in drawers or tucked between diary pages, their value known only to the one who held them. Children often received souvenirs with the greatest delight. A father returning from abroad might place in his child's hand a toy from Germany, a bright ribbon from France, or a carved figure from Africa. These gifts turned distant lands into something intimate, woven into the fabric of family memory. In the end, souvenirs and keepsakes served not just as reminders of where one had travelled, but as anchors for memory itself. Long after the dust of the road had settled, when the traveller once more sat at home by the fire, these tokens could summon back the journey, the smell of sea air, the sound of foreign bells, the laughter of companions. They were more than objects. They were pieces of time carried forward into the future. Every Victorian journey, no matter how grand or how modest, reached its most tender chapter at the end, the return. For weeks or months, the road had stretched forward, each day carrying the traveller farther from home. But at last came the moment when the path turned back, when maps were folded and letters spoke of imminent arrival, and the traveller's heart leaned toward familiar doors. The long journey home was rarely swift. Trains must be caught, ships boarded, coaches endured. At first there was excitement, the eager counting down of days until reunion. But as the miles wore on, fatigue often crept in. The rough seas that had thrilled on the outward voyage now felt tiresome. The jolting of the railway cars that once spoke of adventure became simply noise and dust. Even so, each step nearer to home seemed lighter than the one before. There was also a quiet melancholy. Travellers knew they were leaving behind the wide unknown, the sparkling foreign streets, the mountains that seemed eternal, the strangers whose kindness had turned to memory. So, for some, returning meant slipping back into the routines they had briefly escaped. The thrill of the journey would become the stillness of everyday life. Many wrote in their journals of this strange feeling. Joy and sorrow twined together in the same breath. Victorian homes awaited these returning wanderers with anticipation. Families counted the days, preparing rooms, warming kitchens, imagining the tales that would be told. The moment of reunion was often charged with tears and laughter, a mother clutching her son, a husband greeting his wife, children staring wide-eyed at the souvenirs their parent laid out like treasures. The weary traveller, stepping through the threshold, felt both relief and disbelief. Was it possible that the whole journey, with all its wonders and trials, had been real, and yet the return was never the end? For travellers carried home more than trinkets and worn boots. They brought new eyes with which to see the world. Streets that once seemed ordinary now felt smaller, more precious because they were familiar. The smell of the hearth, the sound of the local church bell, the gentle curve of the garden wall, all became extraordinary after the wideness of the road. Mooredness of the road. Many returned home only to dream of leaving again. Travel had a way of awakening restlessness, of teaching that the world was larger than one's doorstep. Others, however, found deep contentment in the return, cherishing the lessons of distance and settling once more into the rhythm of home. For every Victorian traveller, though, the long journey home was a closing circle. It was proof that one could go out into the world, face storms and discomforts, meet strangers, and still come back to the fireside where love waited. In the quiet of night, as trunks were unpacked and diaries closed, the traveller understood. Journeys end, but they do not vanish. They live on in memory, in letters, in keepsakes, and in the heart, which forever beats with the rhythm of the road. When all journeys were done, when trunks stood empty at the foot of the bed and boots rested in quiet corners, there came a softer chapter, a chapter not of miles and roads, but of memory and meaning. The Victorian traveller, seated by the glow of a hearth, often found the mind wandering back, retracing the path with gentler steps than the body had once endured. What had travel given? Not merely the ache of weary limbs, nor the discomforts of inns and seas, though those were remembered with a certain grim fondness. Travel had opened windows in the imagination. It had shown the traveller that the world was broader than the narrow lanes of childhood, filled with voices that spoke in different tongues, with foods flavoured by distant spices, with faces shaped by other histories. To walk out into the world was to learn humility, the recognition that one's own customs were but a single thread in a vast tapestry. Yet travel also deepened the love of home. The traveller, having touched foreign soil, saw with new eyes the familiar. The village church, the winding river, even the sound of a milk cart on a morning street. These simple things now seemed treasures. Distance had polished them with longing, and returning had restored them with joy. The Victorian traveller often wrote reflections in journals, not only to remember but to teach. In parlours and drawing rooms, stories were told again and again, their details shaped into tales of courage, folly, or wonder. Children listened wide-eyed, spouses smiled knowingly, and friends leaned in to hear of seas crossed, mountains climbed, or strange beds endured. And in the telling, the journey lived again. Perhaps the greatest reflection was this. Travel was not only movement across land and water, but also within the soul. One set out seeking novelty, and returned carrying wisdom. One left as a neighbour, but came back as a citizen of a larger world. Even the smallest keepsake, even the briefest diary entry, bore witness to the truth that travel changed the traveller, quietly and forever. So the Victorian traveller sat back, warmed by the fire, the sound of wind outside reminding them of nights spent under strange roofs. And with a half-smile, they understood journeys never truly end. They fold into memory, they ripple into stories, and they shape the traveller's heart for all the days to come. The story of Victorian travel is not just a tale of dusty carriages, rattling railways, and storm-tossed ships. It is, at its heart, a story of human longing, the desire to see beyond the horizon, to test the limits of endurance, and to carry home memories shaped by distance. For the Victorians, travel was rarely easy. It meant sore feet, sleepless nights, missed connections, and countless small discomforts. Yet in the quiet of a railway carriage or on the deck of a steamship beneath unfamiliar stars, they discovered something greater than mere movement. They found wonder. Travel taught patience, courage, and humility. It revealed the vastness of the world and the fragility of the traveller within it. It showed how quickly laughter could spring from hardship, how strangers could become companions, and how every return home carried both joy and a secret ache for the road left behind. The Victorians are gone. Their journeys folded into history, but their spirit of travel lingers. Each time we set out with a suitcase or look out a train window at the rushing countryside, we echo their steps. We too chase the road that never ends, the endless human journey of seeking, learning, and returning. And so as the last page closes, the carriages grow still, the ships find harbour, the weary traveller rests by the fire. But the story remains alive, carried forward in memory, in imagination, and in the quiet truth that every journey, no matter how small, shapes the traveller forever.